This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews or news, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue. Guess what? Now you can call them on your auto insurance too with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. Get your quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hey there, Gabfest listeners. Before we start the show, I want to let you know about a story coming up a little later. It's from one of our partners, SAP. AI comes at you fast. If you don't get reliable and relevant advice, your business might miss out. Whether you're looking to automate tasks or embed AI in your business processes, SAP can help. To learn more, head to sap.com/AI. And stick around for expert advice on how to embrace AI with confidence. I'm Stephen Metcalf, and this is the Slate Culture Gabfest Celine Dion's Heart Goes On edition. It's Wednesday, July 3rd, 2024. On today's show, a new documentary on Netflix, I Am, Celine Dion, explores the career of the singer Celine Dion, which has been cut short by serious illness. The movie is by the filmmaker Irene Taylor, who was granted apparently unlimited access to make it. To discuss, we'll be joined by Slate's own Carl Wilson, music critic for Slate. And then A Family Affair is also on Netflix. It's a rom-com. It stars Zac Efron as an A-list movie star who falls for his assistant's mom, played by Nicole Kidman. It also stars Joey King as the hilariously Gen Z daughter. And finally, we discuss the odd semantic drift of the word aesthetic. Joining me today is Dan Kois, the author of Vintage Contemporaries, a novel and all-around Olympian Slatester. But the important thing in your bio right now is not the laurels you rest on, but the ones to come. What's the forthcoming novel and when do we see it?
The new book, Hampton Heights, comes out in September, an adventure story set in 1987.
And we will be discussing it on this show, inevitably. I can't wait. And we're joined by Laura Miller, Slate's book and all-around culture critic. Laura, it has been too long. It is great to have you back. Welcome.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here.
Celine Dion is, of course, the French-Canadian singer, total icon. She sold 250 million records by one estimate. She of the supple, soaring, acrobatic vocals, power pop balladry. As a person, icon, and singer, she's all uplift, right? Will to power and uplift. However, for close to 20 years, she's been, unbeknownst previously to the world, now the world knows, seriously ill. A new documentary titled I Am Celine Dion. There is a colon between am and Celine Dion. I Am, Celine Dion is by the Oscar-nominated filmmaker Irene Taylor, who was granted what appears to me to be like virtually unlimited access. That's the way they're describing it to Dion, to make a film about her life and her current struggle. We have the perfect guest to discuss this. Carl Wilson is, of course, in addition to being the Slate music critic, the author of one of the truly definitive books about pop culture and taste ever written, really. Let's Talk About Love. Carl, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
Carl, one of the reasons I didn't say the subtitle to your extraordinary book is that, in fact, I just saw that there are two different subtitles. When it first came out as a 33 1/3, there was one subtitle, but the copy that I have is Let's Talk About Love, Why Other People Have Such Bad Taste. Before we start talking about Celine, let's listen to a clip from the documentary. In the clip, Dion recalls when she began to have problems with her voice and realized that something was seriously wrong. Let's listen.
If every string of my notes are strings, for example, like elastic, like down, the next time that I would try, I would go and the third time and cracking. I cannot bring it down. It's like a muscle thing. So I couldn't do the sound check too long. the warm up too long. But if you don't warm up too long enough, you can hurt yourself. So I was scared. I didn't know what to do. And today the diagnosis is SPS, which is stiff person syndrome. It's in the muscle, it's in the tendons, it's in the nerves. You can't see anything because it's not seeable.
Carl, I should make it more explicit. The reason why you're the perfect guest is your book about pop culture and taste uses as its key figure Celine Dion. You're Canadian. You grew up with her and her music. It seems to me you're the perfect person to describe to us why a voice so associated with triumph breaking down is so significant when it comes to this artist.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Celine Dion, who, became a singing star in her early teens in her native Quebec, and then internationally in Europe at first and finally in America, is that her voice was really her identity on many levels. She had a 5-octave range. She had this incredible projection. The songs that she performed were primarily, although like many divas, she importantly crossed genres. Primarily, she was identified with the power ballad, which is really a vehicle to show off the voice. And in many ways, Celine Dion has always been a vehicle for her voice. She talks about that in the documentary, that her voice was the conductor of her life and she simply followed where it led. So it's beyond simply hitting a career crisis to find herself in this position where she no longer has control of that instrument. It's really an identity crisis. And in many ways, the documentary opens the door to that and shows her to us in a way that she's never been shown before, just really behind the scenes. But, so much of the documentary, she's not wearing makeup. She's kind of in house clothes. She's kind of shuffling around, dealing with domestic life in a shut-in way, which partly begins during in its most intense phase during the pandemic as well. So it's a little bit of a lockdown documentary as well. But it's really, someone in midlife losing the thing that's defined themselves.
Carl, the documentary is very explicitly designed to be Celine's version of her story, in the mode of a lot of cultural documentaries about cultural luminaries these days. There's no backup interviews. There's no talking heads. We see her band in performance with her, but we never hear from her band. And, in press about the documentary, it's clear that that was the goal. Celine wanted to tell her story. And you're right that there's very little vanity in this. Like, we do see her in pretty trying circumstances, particularly for someone who has been so conscious about her image for so long. But I also really got the sense that there wasn't any kind of abdication of control in this documentary, that as vulnerably as she is presenting herself, that she still is exerting a kind of iron will over the way that this vulnerable version of herself is being presented. How has Celine thought about her image over the years, and what did you make of all these scenes of her fingering her old robes and talking about how she suffered for her shoes amidst this moment of like physical trial?
Certainly the most difficult part in some ways to swallow is the extended scene we have with Celine in her warehouse full of outfits and stage props and family souvenirs, like this extraordinary like airport hangar of material goods. And it would be easy to be cynical about that part. I can't help feeling though that in many ways she is the least narcissistic of celebrities. There's, this documentary is, I think, a manifestation of the fact that she feels this incredible drive to serve, and with the way that I was talking about her relationship to her voice is kind of her relationship to her whole career, much of which I feel has never been especially under her control. And one of the things that's poignant about what she's going through right now is that in the past 6-7 years since the death of her husband and manager Renee Angelil, who was much much older than her and discovered her as an adolescent and then eventually
her
married
Svengali,
her,
sort of.
yeah, a chillingly modern Svengali figure. Since he's been gone, we really saw for a period of time Celine seeming to come into her own for the first time and exploring her fashion choices in ways that did not seem like they would have been permitted before, and really sort of living in public in different ways, and then being overwhelmed by this condition. All of that kind of ground to a halt. And so to me, she's trying to find a way to continue her relationship with her audience and doing something that she wouldn't have been allowed to do before. You know, she talks in the documentary about how much they lied about these symptoms as they were coming on for almost 2 decades in her performing career, and how she doesn't want to lie about it anymore, and she wants to explain to the audience what's going on. Now, of course, you know, being a celebrity is a narcissistic position, so that's always going to leak back into it. But I do think that in many ways she feels some kind of responsibility to account for her absence, and she's doing it in this incredibly vulnerable way.
One thing that really struck me about this is that when the documentary opens, Celine Dion is listening to Maria Callas, an opera singer who is, unlike Celine Dion, not famous for her technical skill, but for the incredible emotional range that she brought to her singing, for her musicianship in a way, more than for her virtuosity. And I really found myself, well, first of all, as someone who's not really a Celine Dion fan, I just found myself thinking, oh, this poor lady through the whole thing, because she's just, you know, the scene where she is having the seizure, she's just so vulnerable and abject that, you know, your heart just goes out to her. One thing that her attempts to sing again really brought home to me is that it doesn't require that technological virtuosity to be a great singer. I mean, people like Marianne Faithfull, for example, or I saw Frank Sinatra once towards the very end of his career where his voice was kind of shot, and yet still he was amazing because he had that quality as a musician. And this had me wondering if there might be a way for Celine Dion to become maybe even a better singer, you know, someone who can take this experience, these frustrations and the sort of what must be a terrifying experience of not being able to do the whole thing that her life was organized around, and channel that suffering and frustration and sense of the limitations of the human self and human body into her work to become the kind of singer who's actually a lot more interesting than she was before, when all she did was just sort of blare out these anthems that are so inspirational and kind of one-dimensional in their emotions.
I think it's possible. You know, there is a moment in the documentary where she says, perhaps I could try a different repertoire, but then the audience would have to decide whether they still liked me. And so she's obviously very afraid of breaking, you know, and there's been albums in her mature, you know, sort of post-peak career where she's tried little changes in style and that kind of thing, but they're always sort of framed as these incredibly bold choices, but they're actually very minor adjustments. So for her, I think it's really frightening to step out of the box that she's been defined by.
I watched this documentary with an enormous amount of skepticism, Carl. I'm exactly the person that your book was sort of aimed, whose entire worldview was aimed at obliterating in a totally salutary way, right? I'm a reformed rock snob, and to have someone do a sociology of popular taste that roots that entirely in modes of self-interest and power, to me was revelatory. I mean, it's a brilliant book and a brilliant argument. I am antithetical to Celine Dion as an artist, no interest in her whatsoever. I find her grating. And for a lot of this documentary, I have to admit, I watched it with a degree of cynicism. I mean, this is part of a new genre of seemingly to me, new genre of documentaries. The one recently on the Brat Pack, the one on the supermodels, where Axis is seemingly entirely in Final Cut, entirely controlled by the subject. And yet late in midlife, there is an attempt at a reckoning that strikes one as quite honest and quite revealing. So it's a balance of one's skepticism and cynicism with what apparently is a very human story that hasn't been able, like the celebrity image hasn't allowed it to be fully told until this moment. This is very much like that. I watched it with an enormous degree of cynicism until the last sequence, which as I understand it is really a single sequence of her fighting to get a vocal line correct in a studio. And actually her voice not really sounding like the one we're used to, but taking on a kind of a timbre of maturity, a vulnerability and a timbre of maturity that I don't associate with her, going immediately into a therapeutic session with a physical therapist that turns into the seizure. You know, as Laura described it entirely correctly, she is an absolutely abject human creature vulnerable to the vicissitudes of biology in that moment. If one to that moment didn't have sympathy for Celine Dion, to not have sympathy with her after that would be inhuman, right? And then it takes, I mean, it's a sort of real-time sequence that's very, very difficult to watch. I mean, she's in so much pain. She's being Job-like. She's being laid low, right, by her own body. And then finally, she is brought back to a fairly ordinary state, and she ends both the session and the movie by singing a song. At that moment, I loved Celine Dion, Carl. My defenses against her collapsed completely. And I could not be a bigger champion of her. So anyway, speak to maybe how not only her repertoire and her attitude towards music might change, but the public's attitude towards her surely has to shift in the face of this document.
Well, I mean, what you're describing is the experience that I went through writing my book, where I began from a very sort of skeptical, cynical position and trying to understand her appeal to her broad audience. And while wrestling with what I thought about the art, it was really her as a person, as I sort of immersed myself in Celine Dion land, that became the thing I became attached to. I really think she's a tremendously likable and appealing person, even outside of this crisis. And her reputation has really shifted in the past decade or so for many reasons, I think, where there's much less antagonism around her. But yes, it's impossible to see her in this crisis and not have your heart go out to her just as a human being. And that may be the thing that wins over the remaining cynics. I think one of the things that, the documentary pushes against constantly, because she's saying, yes, if I can't run, I'll walk. And if I can't walk, I'll crawl. But you see her go through that recording experience, which she's struggling with, and then immediately afterwards have this physical crisis, because the nature of the neurological syndrome that she has, stiff person syndrome, is that overstimulation of the kind that comes out of performing, and certainly the kind that comes out of live performing with lights and amplified sound and that kind of thing, is exactly the kind of thing that triggers these problems. So, she might never be able to do what she did before in remotely the same way again. And the documentary, I think, by following that sequence through, tells you the counter narrative to the hopeful one that she's trying to present. And I think I really appreciate that there's that dark undercurrent of realism in it. And so that's something to be appreciated about this situation as well.
Carl, as expected, you were the perfect person to talk to about this subject. Thanks so much for coming on. But before you go, can you give us maybe a somewhat lesser known, but somehow also perfectly apt for our segment Celine Dion song to go out on?
I will never miss any opportunity to advocate for the song that Celine did with Barry Gibb of the Bee Gees.
Oh, nice.
On Let's Talk About Love. And since this is a documentary very much about mortality, perhaps it's appropriate to go out on the song Immortality.
All right. Thanks, man. Come back soon.
Absolutely.
Have you heard who the latest power couple is? Well, you won't see this coming. It's Discover and Cash Back. Feeling let down? You won't be when you hear how Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. All with no sign-up required and no limit to how much they'll match. See? Isn't that a couple you want to root for? Get rewarded no matter who you are or how much you spend with Discover. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
This podcast is brought to you by Slate Studios and SAP. AI is moving so fast. If you don't get reliable and relevant advice, your business might miss out. Welcome to Dear Artie, an advice column from SAP, where we tackle the tricky questions at the intersection of AI and business. Let's meet our expert.
Hi, I'm Ian Khan. I'm a technology futurist, speaker, and author, and I love to help organizations measure their current state of readiness for an AI-driven world. I'm excited to dive into today's question.
Dear Artie, our finance team is top-notch, but small. How can AI support them? Signed, Financially Drained.
Well, financially drained, a lot is happening in finance and AI, and the possibilities are endless. First of all, AI can help your finance team analyze massive amounts of financial data faster than any human or a team of people could do. Second, it can help perform functions on data through algorithms. This can connect different systems together and really simplify decision-making for your finance team. And last but not least, AI can help reduce the time needed for data to provide insights so that your leaders can make faster decisions.
Embrace AI with confidence. Head to sap.com/AI to learn more.
All right. Well, our only item of business to tell you about today is the Slate Plus segment. We will be discussing an article in the New York Times called The Vexing Problem of the Medium Friend by Lisa Miller, June 22nd in the Times. It's about how people manage their portfolio of friends and how consciously or not they assign a certain value or priority to various friends, the ones closest, the ones furthest, and then this phenomenon under-discussed of medium friends somewhere ambiguously in between. We will discuss. I do want to say while I have you, if you're not a Slate Plus member, you can sign up today at slate.com/culture plus. Members get ad-free podcasts, lots of bonus content like Slate Plus segment that I just mentioned. You'll get to hear members-only programming on other Slate shows like Slow Burn, the Political Gabfest. Members get unlimited access to all the great writing on slate.com. You will never, ever hit a paywall if you are a Slate Plus member. I should also mention that you'll be supporting our work and the work of our brilliant colleagues. These memberships, and I really mean it, they are very important to Slate. They're incredibly important to the Culture Gabfest. So please consider, please sign up today at slate.com/culture plus. That's slate.com/culture plus. Help us keep the lights on and talking to you. All right, let's move on. Zac Efron is Chris Cole, a charming, swole, and quite shallow A-list star anchoring a Marvel-like superhero franchise. His assistant is Zara, played by Joey King, a 20-something who enjoys calling him on his bullshit. Chris is sailing through life, a happy-go-lucky, overpaid narcissist, when he meets cute Zara's mother, Brooke, a gifted and actually quite serious writer who brings to the surface his vulnerable and sensitive self. Such is the movie A Family Affair, now on Netflix. Many hijinks ensues, you would expect. The movie is directed by a showbiz vet, Richard LaGravenese. In the clip we're about to hear, Zara's in the process of quitting her job for Chris, and they get into a very screwball-like back and forth. Let's listen.
Zara, come on, I can't find someone to trust in a weekend.
Well, I can't have my job held over my head like I'm a hostage. God, Chris, I work my ass off for you, and for what?
Do you like doing this? You're making Mila cry.
You know what? 2 years ago, you said I would start as your assistant, and I'd learn the business, then I'd become associate producer, and then producer, and eventually work up to running your company.
You have no experience producing.
And how am I gonna get experience, Chris, when all I do is pick up your dry cleaning? God, I mean, I told you to do that Raymond Farr movie, and you didn't listen, and the actor who did do it got an Oscar.
Because I can't play a blind alcoholic. It goes against my iconography. My eyes are too pretty to not be on camera.
I told you we'd see your eyes. It's not a Stevie Wonder biopic.
Laura, I think of you as an intelligent person's guide to pulp. That's not the only hat you wear, but when you wear it beautifully. And so I'm dying to know what you thought of this movie.
So this movie, I loved the first maybe 15 or 20 minutes. I thought that the relationship between Zara and Chris was hilarious. I loved that she worked for him and she had to do all these absurd things for him, like go to the supermarket for him in the middle of the night or late at night because he can't go anywhere because he's too famous. And also that she was his conduit to the outside world. So while she was in the supermarket, she's describing, the products to him that he has never had the chance to see because he hasn't been to a supermarket in so long. And he's being nostalgic about the misters in the produce section. And it felt really very precisely observed and funny. And their dynamic was really interesting because she was his assistant, but she wasn't afraid of him or really deferential to him. And so they had this strange, almost couple-like relationship, maybe like siblings or something. And then there was these other funny details, like he lives in this sort of modernist monstrosity of a house, and the front door is absurdly huge and heavy, and she has to throw her whole weight on it to get it to open or close. And so it prevents anyone from making these sort of really dramatic gestures. Like he says, don't slam that door when she quits. And of course she can't because she can barely move it. And so I was like, this is so much funnier than I thought it would be. And then as soon as the romance started, I completely lost interest because I have to say, well, I have interest in various forms of pulp fiction. I'm not the world's biggest romance fan. And so there needs to be some cleverness or some banter to it that lifts it into the sort of screwball comedy realm or the Howard Hawks realm for me to really get invested in the couple. And she was just sort of almost saintly. She was really dull, I thought, just sort of perfect mom. And then, everything she does is perfect. And so I had no interest in her. And Zac Efron and Nicole Kidman both look like they're made out of plasticine. He really looks like an action figure. But the biggest problem for me was that I wanted those first 15 minutes to be the whole movie. Like I would watch a whole movie about that relationship that doesn't really go anywhere and be perfectly happy. But as soon as I was asked to be invested in that, ridiculous romance, which I never really believed in for a minute, I just was like, nah.
That is funny that the movie invests all its screwball energy in the subsidiary relationship, or at least what is meant to be the subsidiary relationship. And it gives all the flaws to all the non-Nicole Kidman characters. Like the daughter has a bunch of interesting, realistic flaws. She herself is very narcissistic. She is not that good of a friend. She's a little bit of a diva herself. She has the kinds of flaws that you would ordinarily want the romantic heroine to have, to liven up that relationship and to give it screwball energy. But the actual relationship at the center doesn't exactly have that. It's a lot more gentle, and it's sort of a soft romance, and it's about him discovering himself and her leading him through those paces, which I agree is generally less interesting. Yet all the same, I found this a truly enjoyable trifle. And what I liked most about it are the kinds of interesting lessons you can take from it about how Hollywood is trying to figure out mass movie making in the year 2024. Like that this Netflix product is part Hallmark Christmas movie, part Nancy Meyers, part a kind of like celebrity gossip backstager that really knows how celebrity works. And I liked trying sort of untangling all these different bits. That it's Richard LaGravenese is trying to figure out how you get a movie made when you're 64. And it's Zac Efron trying to figure out how he might have a grown up, like mass cult career. And it's most of all, it's Nicole Kidman trying and somewhat failing to figure out how to appear as a human being on screen again. And I like watching all those struggles, I find that really interesting. And the result to me was something that was like totally watchable. It is like no surprise that it is seemingly with a bullet the number one movie on Netflix now.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I just totally loved it. It's like a great airplane movie, and if you go in with that as your bar, you'll clear it and enjoy it. I agree that it's a bit of a funny Frankenstein, and there are pacing issues. It's an interesting structural choice to have the Rosalind Russell, Cary Grant screwball relationship be that leg of the triangle between the daughter and the boss. I thought in a weird way that worked because among the things I liked about it, first of all, I love the trope of the movie star who's an infant. And the jokes at his expense, I think, are hilariously funny. And he just rides the line nicely enough between being kind of in on the joke and kind of not in on the joke. So when he reveals himself to be a good guy, it doesn't seem preposterous. But secondly, I also really like the premise that he's super famous, but doesn't have the power in the relationship because she's too good, i.e. smart for him. And I thought that was actually played very deftly, lightly. It's not a deep movie, but and then they're united in a certain pathos that I found quite believable, which is that she's a widow and he's lost a close family member. And the moment is very tiny, but I actually felt the Velcro, adhere them to my heart in that moment. The other thing I would say is that you said Nancy Meyers, Dan. I love it. It's in my notes too. This is an unapologetic pre-End Times throwback. There's it's like a Nancy Meyers movie. A writer who writes for Vogue and the New Yorker somehow lives in a $9 million house and is being treated like she's the middle class character. There's a broken and possibly to be reconstituted family structure.
A wisecracking mother-in-law played perfectly by Kathy Bates.
Thank you. Yes, exactly that. And a dick who turns out to be a lovable dick. And the whole thing, they kind of nail it. But what I'm interested to think through, Laura, maybe you can help me a little bit, is I said it glibly, but I kind of mean it. I mean, we don't live in the 1990s anymore. This is a nostalgia trip for what movies could be in 1990. Inequality is grotesque. It eats at 99+% of the country. And there's a total unconsciousness about class and almost total unconsciousness about race. They live in a world where things can be set right with a nice sentiment. I guess my question is sort of, A, did that strike you as the case? How did it hit you as a viewer? But also just in general, do you imagine that people want to escape into this time capsule from 1994, or are they going to resent a picture like this? I guess it's number one on Netflix, so we have an answer. But
I mean, I admit I spent much of the movie wondering what her late husband did for a living, because I was like, no way could she afford that house on whatever, kind of writer she was made. No writer could afford that house unless they maybe were a screenwriter. I just assumed he was someone in show business as well.
Good point. Yeah. Oh, that's right.
I know. It
That's
makes
right.
no sense. It makes no sense. I think, though, that, you have to remember, talking of screwball comedies or Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, those movies were hits during the Great Depression. So I don't think that people always want to see movies address the pressing issues of our time or even necessarily acknowledge them. So while she has a best friend who also has a boyfriend and they appear to be people of color, the casting is somewhat diverse. There really isn't, it's really a vacation from thinking about that stuff, which I think people do want. Like, I don't think there's any glaring contrast. The difference would be just the vehicle for stuff like this, because people aren't going to movie theaters 2 or 3 times a week the way they did during the Depression. Maybe they're watching rom-coms on Netflix 2 or 3 times a week, and that's enough. I don't know. But I don't think that the sort of escapism of the subject matter disqualifies it from having a lot of appeal at a super stressful time like this. It's more the business model than anything else.
Movies like this, the Nancy Meyers style movie, has often been described in a certain way for its target audience or for sort of its ideal audience. And I often think of this series of like novelty books the kinds that are like on the counter at Urban Outfitters that came out in the early 2000s that were called porn for women. And the joke of it was that it was like a hot Zac Efron-y type guy, photos of him vacuuming and taking out the trash and doing childcare and stuff like that. And the joke of it was gender essentialist and stupid, but it was also a funny joke. And it also strikes me that in a lot of ways, this is designed to be a kind of porn for like a middle-aged mom. And I don't mean only in that it's a middle-aged mom getting together with Zac Efron. I also mean that the surfaces in the classic Nancy Meyers way are also meant to be aspirational in that way. You are not only aspiring to Zac Efron when you watch this movie, you were aspiring to that kitchen, you were aspiring to that wardrobe, you're aspiring to that view, and you're aspiring to what I found the most moving part of the movie, the part that I think many viewers will find far more emotionally beautiful than the idea of sleeping with Zac Efron, which was that the big climactic speech in this movie comes between the mother and the daughter, and it is the daughter finally telling the mother that she appreciates all she's done for her in her childhood, even though she was a difficult teenager. The payoff for that is incredible, and I think that is going to be the thing that many viewers come out of this movie remembering.
Okay. All right. Well, it's a family affair. It's on Netflix. I think we all agreed we genuinely enjoyed watching it. Check it out. Let us know what you think.
Deciding what to pack for a trip can be stressful. I can speak to that being on a trip right now. The clothes you're bringing need to match the weather where you're going. You need to feel good in them. They need to be packable. Well, that's where Quince comes in. Quince has high-quality vacation essentials you'll be packing for many trips to come. They have items in summer fabrics like linen and silk. Silk is one of Quince's specialties. They even have premium luggage options for your travel, and they're all priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. That's because by partnering directly with top factories, Quince cuts out the cost of the middleman and passes the savings on to you. You know, Quince couldn't ask for more organic advertising this week because I happen to be on a trip visiting family in California, and I happen to have packed a Quince item in my luggage, which is the black silk tiered maxi dress that I think I've mentioned before. That's my favorite latest Quince essential, and I've already worn it twice on the trip. It's great when you can find an item that travels well while looking good, and Quince has a lot of choices for exactly that. Pack your bags with high-quality essentials from Quince. Go to quince.com/culture for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/culture to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/culture. This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI won't help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, and automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations so you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
All right. For our third topic today, we're discussing an essay that appeared in The Cut on June 20th. It's called In Defense of Calling Everything an Aesthetic by Erin Schwartz. The piece begins by describing a Reddit chaos involving a thread on aesthetics, which was meant to be a serious, philosophically grounded conversation about the nature of beauty and taste. But it devolved immediately into sort of the self-curation that defines the internet age. What I liked about this piece, Dan, is that at least it didn't go in for a tisk-tisking about the loose way in which the term aesthetics has migrated semantically in popular usage. As Schwartz says, in naming aesthetics, you appoint yourself art historian of the mundane stuff that populates your life. Isn't this just a perfectly ordinary human demotic way to use a term that maybe once had a highfalutin definition, but who cares?
Yeah, well, it's the classic migration of a word or a concept from a high culture to mid culture. And what I liked about this piece and what I like about the use of the term is that it does give you a way to connect your online life with your real world life, with your meat space life. And it, for young people, particularly, like for my daughter in particular, the way that she has defined herself over time in the aesthetic sense, in the internet aesthetic sense, has become a memorable part of her own personal history. The way that has evolved, I think, is part of the story she will tell about her teenagehood. And in the same way that I defined myself once only through, as far as I know, the specific bands I listened to, this is a like slightly broader, more holistic version of that self-definition.
But then it raises the question, why are we calling this an aesthetic as opposed to just one's taste? What gain and meaning is there is it just kind of a grab at a sort of, sad anachronistic prestige to call taste an aesthetic?
Well, I think it's more than just taste. I mean, like a lot of people during the pandemic, I looked at a lot of TikTok and I became completely fascinated by the phenomenon of the TikTok aesthetic, which would be like a short video with a lot of cut together clips of like, if we're going to talk about something like cottagecore, it would be like a steaming teapot and a vase of flowers in a window and a girl walking through a meadow in a long sort of filmy dress, old-fashioned looking dress, and then somebody baking scones. And then you would see in the comments, or sometimes even in the text that appears in the video itself, a person saying, usually a young woman, because cottagecore has a very strong sort of young lesbian component. I just want to move to a house in the woods with my girlfriend and raise goats and bake all day and grow flowers and tomatoes or something like that. And it was as much a sort of aspirational lifestyle. I mean, because this also came with the sense that this wasn't available to the person saying this. Like occasionally there would be some sort of influencer type person who had somehow gotten a cottage in the Pacific Northwest somewhere and was able to make really vibey TikToks about it, and everyone envied her. But then that person would then be attacked for having enough money to be able to do this. And so, there was just, it was like a whole lifestyle that was sort of telegraphed in these videos that people would then elaborate on and sort of moon over. That to me, again, I mean, if we were talking about escapism with the Family Affair movie, I mean, there's definitely just a sense of wanting to retreat from the rest of the world in many of these aesthetics, although not all of them, of course. So I think they're more than just like how I would decorate my house. They represent an approach to life that people, at least, like, they might not be able to move to the woods with their girlfriend and not really talk to anybody else, but just milk cows and bake scones. But they would, if they did decorate their room in such a cottagecore way, it represented that as an aspiration.
It's interesting. So listening to both of you, I come around that taste and lifestyle get you only part of the way there in understanding what people now mean by aesthetic. It's not a clean one-for-one swap by any means. The difference, I suppose, is that social media, TikTok and Instagram specifically, require a renovated concept to try to understand the modes of self-presentation on them. And you're just being way too bricks and mortar if you call it taste or a lifestyle. So what then is this component that accounts for the difference? And I think it's possible to think of taste and lifestyle as, I wouldn't say unself-conscious, right? There's always some sense of self-presentation to others in either one. But something with social media changed, that this very finely calibrated sense of being seen has worked its way into our self-presentation in a new sense. And so in all things, well, certainly in all things that you do online, there's an anonymous audience to whom you are, a largely anonymous audience to whom you're presenting yourself, which is different from having this new friend over to see your house or browse through your record collection. I guess, Dan, what I wonder is aesthetic a kind of alibi for the extent to which we live by implication through the implied gaze of other people on everything we do? Or am I still thinking about it in too much of a pre-postmodern mindset?
I think taste always was that to some extent. It's just that the audience is different now. Like when I was growing up, listening to REM and basing my entire personality on that, it was for an audience. And I was aspiring to something, as Laura says, even if I didn't exactly understand what. But that audience consisted of kids in my high school and girls I wanted to impress. And in 2024, that audience rarely are people in your, whatever, in your high school or your college. Maybe there are a couple of people who share your aesthetic in real life, but primarily it's for the grander audience for whom we are all performing and branding ourselves at all times, the internet. And I don't know that actually is that different. It's different in that it's more parasocial, and you lose some aspect of community that once existed. If you, for example, were a goth or something, you could be a goth with a bunch of other goths in your high school, and that would create something for you in your life that you otherwise might not have had. But I also think that the young people don't prioritize real world interaction the way that I do, and don't necessarily view a purely online relationship or a purely online social world or social connections as necessarily worse or less meaningful than real world ones. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't necessarily view it as that different in the way that it's treated by young people today than it was when I was young.
But Laura, I loved REM too, and maybe they weren't my identity, but who was? I don't know. Let's say The Replacements or something for a while. And at the same time, there was Martha Stewart on TV and in her magazine and various other media, creating a kind of world, creating what I think one could fairly call an aesthetic, and commercializing it. These two things have collapsed into one another to create something new, no? Or am I misreading this?
I mean, I find this whole phenomenon fascinating because not in high school, but in my 20s, I cycled through, I wouldn't even say I cycled through, there were multiple aesthetics, and I would definitely call them that I inhabited depending on who I was hanging out with. So there were punks that I hung out with, and I dressed a certain way and listened to certain music, went to certain clubs. There were mods. There was like a whole group house out in the Sunset District in San Francisco with mods living in it. And they rode Vespas, and they wore parkas and little suits, and they listened to the Jam, and they shopped at certain shops. And this is the same thing with the rockabilly kids that I knew. They had a particular vintage store run by like a woman who was a major figure in that scene. And each aesthetic came with some lifestyle stuff that I would definitely say the rockabilly people tended to be more coupled up and settled down, and the mods were just kind of like frat boys in stovepipe trousers. But they were aesthetics. I mean, they were comprehensive, like they influenced the music you listened to, but also the movies you liked and the books you read and the people you hung out with.
Even the way you talked. It influenced your language.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I moved among these to like kind of a remarkable degree without having that much of an established identity in any one of them. And so like a lot of the complaints about the sort of modern day aesthetics is that they're sort of disposable, and people just sort of rifle through them and try them on and then move on to something else, but they don't really have anything that real invested in the taste. And I just feel like that was me. And I don't really feel like, my engagement with all of that stuff was less genuine. It was just really fun. And that's what you do at that age. You try on a lot of identities.
And like, what a gift to young people to have this way to try on all these identities with like essentially zero risk, not even social risk.
Yes, exactly. But on the other hand, I am still friends with some of the people that I knew back then. And those are great friendships, decades and decades later. I mean, I do appreciate there is a difference between being part of a subculture that has an aesthetic, like those subcultures that I participated in, and just sort of following someone on social media. I understand what you're saying, Dan, that maybe kids today do not make that distinction, but that doesn't mean that the distinction doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Laura, you actually live cottagecore now. Is it everything that everyone's dreamed of?
I know, that was the crazy thing about it. I just started looking at TikTok because I was bored, and then suddenly I found all this cottagecore stuff, and I was like, now I'm doing it. I'm not in my 20s anymore, but now I'm living cottagecore.
I love it.
But of course, cottagecore doesn't, this is something we probably will get into in our Plus discussion, but cottagecore is also a fantasy of what it's, of rural life that doesn't really have much relationship to what actual rural life is like.
That's true. You have to milk your cows to live.
Exactly.
There you go. All right, well, let's leave it there. The piece is called In Defense of Calling Everything an Aesthetic by Erin Schwartz. Curious to hear what listeners think on this one. Let's move on.
Wildcard is a new podcast that asks big questions you won't hear anywhere else. Famous guests like Jenny Slate, Chris Pine, and Bowen Yang have to answer whatever question gets drawn from a special deck of cards. What's a goal you're glad you gave up on? What's a belief you had to let go of?
Oh.
What's the biggest sacrifice you've ever made? Listen to Wildcard wherever you get your podcasts, only from NPR.
All right, now is the moment in our podcast when we endorse. Dan, what do you have?
Well, first of all, Steve, I would like to cry foul during this endorsements segment. 3 weeks ago, I was on the show. In the endorsements, you asked us to listen to an Emmylou Harris song and email you who we thought wrote it. That afternoon at 3:10 p.m., I emailed you. I will now quote my email in full. Okay, I listened to that Emmylou song. I have no idea who wrote it, or rather anyone who I would think wrote it, I assume is wrong because of the way you framed the question. So I'm going to guess like Leonard Cohen. And I was right. And you did not credit me on the podcast the next week.
Well,
I cry foul.
It's because you spoiled the party. Why did I set the whole thing up is for the reveal, like snatch away the sheet and reveal underneath Leonard Cohen. And you're like, I don't know, Leonard Cohen. And
it was one of my all-time great accomplishments. I do think there's something a little bit Canadian about that song. But I think the reason I knew it is that I went back and checked, and the 20th anniversary edition of Jennifer Warren's Leonard Cohen album, Blue Raincoat, has a version of that song, which I bet Spotify fed me at some point.
Fair enough.
All right. Now I will actually endorse. This is an endorsement for everyone, but also specifically for men, which is to read Miranda July's new novel, All Fours, so that you will know what every woman you know is talking about with her friends. The book is fascinating. It's very enjoyable. It's a little bit ridiculous. It's beautifully written. It is full of stuff to think about. But also, every woman you know between 45 and 55 is texting with her friends about this book. So it is useful from a reconnaissance standpoint to know what's going on.
Very cool. And Laura, what do you have?
I'm also recommending a book. This is called The Ministry of Time by Callie-Ann Bradley. It's a debut, I believe, and it's kind of a breakout hit for the summer. It's a little bit of a spy thriller, a little bit of time travel, science fiction, a little bit romance. It's narrated by a young woman who has the job of minding a person who has been brought from the past to the present day of her time, which is slightly in the future. And she is made in charge of this polar explorer who's been lifted out of the late 19th century, and she has to sort of adjust him to living in the contemporary world. And there are a couple of other visitors of this kind, or abductees, if you want to call them that, with other minders. So there's a whole sort of workplace intrigue situation going on. It's very clever. It's witty. It's interesting in that the main character is the child of, it's British. It's set in England, and the main character is British, but she is the daughter of a Cambodian immigrant. So her mother and this man that she is taking care of are sort of in weirdly similar situations, being asked to fit into a society where they don't quite fit. Only he, as in his mind, it's his society. So there's a lot of adjustments to make. And it has a romance in it. And I know I said before that I'm not the world's biggest romance fan, but this one really worked for me.
That sounds fun, like inverse Connie Willis.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm this week endorsing a piece of writing, not a book, but it's an essay in the London Review of Books by Julian Barnes, of course, the novelist. It's called Art and Memory. If you have trouble getting behind the paywall, maybe we can help you out a little bit with a PDF. But it's just such a great essay because it's very essayistic. I mean, he's working out ideas that he doesn't have any pat answers to. And the occasion of it is he's bought a painting and it looks different from the photo. He buys it from a catalog. It looks different than the photo in the catalog. And he begins to essayistically explore this question of the relationship of paintings to memory, because you very often see a painting, as it were, in the flesh, and then don't see it again for decades if it's in somewhere in a cathedral or in Europe or a museum that you don't have ready access to. It's in the Prado or something. And yet there are all these memory substitutes now. Of course, the classic one had been pre-internet had been the postcard, and you go to a museum gift shop, and as a mnemonic souvenir going forward, you buy a postcard. But of course, you can't ever fully recreate the scale and the texture of a work or the experience of seeing it, in situ or whatever. And so he begins to explore that discrepancy between memory and the experience of a work of art, what it's like to go back to a work that profoundly you felt altered your sense of what art or being human is, only to see it 20 years later and have a very different experience. And it's just lovely. And he asks all these wonderful questions. Is there something in the art itself which makes us remember it more or less clearly? For instance, memory rarely lets you down with Hockney's work, clean and clear, memorable in the best way, and normally just the same when revisited. Whereas you might be hard put to describe from memory. Or Rothko, though you might better recall its overall effect on you. It's a modest essay that nonetheless says something profound about both painting and the human mentality that attempts to apprehend it. And I highly recommend it.
I really love that essay. And I like when Barnes writes about art in the LRB because he's good and interesting. And also because the letters for the next couple of issues are full of people getting angry at him about stuff. But people who feel he doesn't really know what he's talking about. Sometimes it's true he doesn't. And that's really enjoyable. But one of the letters in response to that piece was an incredible one from a seemingly a somewhat wealthy person who talked about a painting that he loved so much that it went on auction and he bought it. And then when it arrived in his house, it was 7 times as big as he thought it was. And it completely ruined the experience for him, that he now had this enormous painting in his home of a thing that he thought was like a small, subtle, like portrait. And it's destroyed his living room.
What a weird problem to have.
That's true.
I do, Steve. I do really like the essays that, as you said, are the classic essays, in that it's a person figuring out what they think instead of somebody just sort of coming at you with both barrels about what they think and how there can be no other understanding of the situation. I really like that more exploratory essay.
Yeah, it's really lovely, really conversational, very open-ended. Thank you, Dan, so much for coming on the show, as always. Really wonderful.
Thanks.
Laura, you too. I hope we do this again soon.
Yes, always a pleasure.
You'll find links to some of the things we talked about today at our show page. That's slate.com/culturefest, and you can email us at culturefest@slate.com. Our introductory music is by the composer Nicholas Pertel. Our production assistant is Kat Hong. Our producer is Jared Downing. For Laura Miller and Dan Poyce, I'm Stephen Metcalf. Thank you so much for joining us. We will see you soon.